bombs away, quite literally, in Yemen, ending military support for the phony government in Egypt, and changing the way we provide food to the world's neediest. We have a lot to get to today, and you're not going to want to miss this episode of the Team Policy Podcast. Well, we have a lot of important cases to get to today, but first, a quick word from our sponsor this week, Impact Debate and Speech Coaching. Matthew Gray started IDSC because he has a passion for teaching students how to utilize reason and logic. As a high school debater, he developed a deep passion for the competition. Now he enjoys sharing his knowledge and experience with a new generation of competitors. All IDSC coaches share that same drive and goal. Stephen and I, my debate partner, who is not here this week, unfortunately, can personally account for the quality of coaching you will receive from IDSC. Matthew Gray, the founder, actually was my first student coach at my debate club, and he personally coached Stephen and I at nationals. The coaching you'll get from IDSC is really top notch, and right now you can actually buy a membership from them for just $45. With that, you'll get 3 well-written affirmative cases. You get at least 10 top-notch negative briefs. You get a coach who is only a few clicks away if you have any questions or issues regarding one of their cases. You get special member discounts for things like personal coaching and more. Guys, don't wait. Go and check them out right now at impactdebatecoach.com. Again, that's impactdebatecoach.com, impactdebatecoach.com. Enjoy the impact of excellence with Impact Debate Coaching at impactdebatecoach.com. Okay, onto the topic. So first of all, this week we're going to be talking about Saudi Arabia and all the issues here with Saudi Arabia. So as a quick intro to some of the situational stuff that's going on in Saudi Arabia geopolitically with regards to Yemen, and just politically with regards to Jamal Khashoggi, the death that really I'm sure anyone listening to this is well aware of. This is from The Guardian recently in 2018, writing, quote, "For the dozens of women and other activists arrested in Saudi Arabia this past year alone, Jamal Khashoggi's disappearance last week at the Saudi embassy in Istanbul will not have come as a surprise. For those who have been able to leave the kingdom after speaking out, meanwhile, it's now become overwhelmingly clear that even on the outside, they need to be extremely careful. The regime has a knack for using threats against family members as leverage in return for silence. These threats have taken on a new, alarming meaning. The thoroughness of the Saudi regime in silencing opponents has significantly increased since Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman came into power in 2017. I investigated this increase in detentions in a report I co-authored in January this year, again, by the author over at The Guardian. They continue writing, quote, "We were requested by the families of some of those detained to release our findings in an attempt to get more governments and the United Nations to act to have them released. The report found that more than 60 perceived opponents of the Saudi government had been arrested, including prominent human rights defenders, in a major crackdown by the Saudi authorities. To date, no concrete steps have been taken to free them. They remain detained with the exact whereabouts of many still unknown." And the article goes on, but the gist here that is going on in Saudi Arabia, the issues that people are concerned about with a lot of cases that you're going to see, is that there's a lot of human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia. And when we get down to the root of the issue, the fact is Saudi Arabia is an authoritarian government. It's run, it's a monarchy. It's an ultimate monarchy, which means that the crown prince, who is considered in power, his father, the king, they have total and complete authority with basically no checks on their power, other than theoretically the military, which serves them pretty loyally, it seems. So you have a very powerful regime that is not fond of anyone that wants to go against the flow, so to speak. And we see this with people who advocate human rights getting imprisoned, getting taken away, basically getting forced to disappear.
Quick
The
question.
instance with Jamal. Yeah, go ahead.
So Elijah here. I was wondering, is this the activists, are they like political activists or civil activists? Like, are they fighting for less oppressive Sharia law, or are they fighting for different government? Or do you have anything to say specifically what? what they're being jailed
Right, so it's
for.
really a swath of activists. So basically, anyone who does not advocate the position of the government or the position of the status quo is being viewed really as an enemy. In fact, the article says, and I quote, those arrested have all been smeared and labeled as traitors. They face trial and long prison sentences on bogus security charges that are completely unsubstantiated. And basically, what this article is talking about here is largely it seems to be human rights activists, women's rights activists, people trying to westernize Saudi Arabia a little bit,
Hmm.
pull it away from maybe not entirely towards American culture, but really in the direction of that rather than harsh, strong Islamic law.
I don't,
Um,
well, like, we should make a distinction. Do they want to pull Saudi Arabia closer to American culture or to Western values?
Really, it doesn't go into detail on that, but the issue that's more at hand here that a lot of the background leading up to any case with Saudi Arabia is probably going to focus on is the fact that in general, the government of Saudi Arabia is authoritarian and they do not support human rights
Hmm.
whatsoever. They really support whatever's best for the position of the government, it seems like, whatever secures or promulgates the power of the government. And since human rights activism or protesting or demanding that the government do things, anyone in those camps, regardless of how good or bad they are, it tends to get viewed by the government as an opponent of the status quo, which is very troubling. Now, I will say there are people out there who are probably going to make the claim that, well, they have been improving with some reforms. They have allowed women to drive recently in Saudi Arabia. They've made some um, sort of appeasements to the public. But the bigger issue at hand is that Saudi Arabia does not have strong human rights, and they probably are not changing as much as we'd like them to in the short term.
I'm just gonna say real quick that this sounds a lot like Soviet Union. If you're not
Right.
with us entirely, you're against us, and you should be viewed with suspicion. And also trumping up security charges, which is what Soviet Union would do. They'd accuse like millions of people of spying just for having been in another country. They don't really need a case; they need them out of the way.
Right, and that's really the issue here, which is important sort of for the background again of any case because there are definitely some Saudi Arabia cases out there, but um, one of the things you're going to see predominantly is talk about human rights and really the lack of human rights in Saudi Arabia. They're a very authoritarian regime. They do not support freedom or those sorts of standards that as Americans we're very used to. And then leading into this, this is really in some ways the bigger issue that you're going to see a lot of cases focus on is the war in Yemen. This is from the BBC quite recently. They wrote, quote, the conflict has its roots in the failure of a political transition supposed to bring stability to Yemen following an Arab Spring uprising that forced its longtime authoritarian president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, to hand over his power to his deputy, Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi, in 2011. As president, Mr. Hadi struggled to deal with a variety of problems, including attacks by jihadists, a separatist movement in the south, the continuing loyalty of security personnel to Saleh, as well as corruption, unemployment, and food insecurity. Ali Abdullah Saleh was forced to hand over power to Hadi and the Houthi government, which champions. This is going on to the next sentence. The Houthi government, which champions Yemen's Zaidi Shia Muslim minority and fought a series of rebellions against Saleh during the previous decade, took advantage of the new president's weakness by taking control of the northern heartland of the Sayda province and neighboring areas. Disillusioned with the transition, many ordinary Yemenis, including Sunnis, supported the Houthis, and in late 2014 and early 2015, the rebels took over Sana'a. The Saudi-led multinational coalition intervened in the conflict in Yemen in March 2015. The Houthis and security forces loyal to Saleh, who is thought to have backed his erstwhile enemies in a bid to regain power, then attempted to take control of the entire country, forcing Mr. Hadi to flee abroad in March 2015, alarmed by the rise of a group they believe to be backed militarily by regional Shia power Iran. Saudi Arabia and 8 other mostly Sunni Arab states began an air campaign aimed at restoring Mr. Hadi's government. The coalition received logistical and intelligence support from the US, UK, and France. Now, that's a lot of information to digest, but I'm going to break it down really quickly. So basically, there was a leader, the leader of Yemen, refused to step down from his position, and eventually that led to an uprising, which forced him to hand over his power to his second in command. And what happened during that power transition was there was a bit of a vacuum or a bit of vulnerability, and militant groups took advantage of that and started a civil war essentially in Yemen. And what happens here in these very complex geopolitical situations is you have Shia and Sunni Muslims, you have all these different sort of ethnic groups within this Arab country, and you have different religious sects of Islam, and you have conservative and more liberal sects of Islam. That's probably an oversimplification of it, but the Shias and the Sunnis went to war essentially, and that's turned into a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The United Arab Emirates are heavily involved in it, and what that has caused is through this proxy war, it's sort of a proxy religious war. That's largely what fuels the conflict between the groups, and you have these big oil-rich countries flooding arms, airstrikes, attacks from one side to the other. And then that got even more complicated recently whenever some group within Yemen, got a hold of a ballistic missile and fired it at Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. So it's a very complicated situation that was supposed to only last for a few months and has turned into a several years long now humanitarian crisis with lots and lots of civilian casualties. Um, it's a big issue, and what teams are going to say with this, and this is the big issue going on to sort of the affirmative plans that you're going to see on this, is any plan will make some attempt to, they can't really cut aid, but they're going to try to cut arms sales to Saudi Arabia or cut off support for this war in Yemen. That's
Yeah.
what, at the end of the day, it's going to boil down to. They could talk about human rights, and that would be a valid point, but they're going to focus on the war in Yemen because that is what's getting all the news press lately.
Okay.
For negative teams, the U.S. Senate recently actually imposed the War Powers Act of 1974, which was used to basically end the Vietnam War, and has actually just ended recently, just literally days ago, ended U.S. support for the Saudis fighting in Yemen, and has restricted our coalition support solely to fighting terrorists in the region, so not actually just anyone there. So that's a big inherency problem for any affirmative. But
Now,
the
is the arms sales topical? Like, does it count as U.S. aid?
right,
Because
and that is the other issue. This is
usually
going
I
to
think of
turn
U.S.
on
aid as like under the U.S. aid, what is it?
under the USAID budget,
The federal agency, the U.S. aid, federal
the U.S.
agency.
Agency for International Development.
Yeah.
I believe you mean.
No, which it's not always that, but that's usually what I think first when it comes to mind.
Right, right. Well, that's a totally valid point. This gets a little bit dicey because I think a lot of it will come down to two things. It'll come down to your definitions. Definitions are extremely important in any case with Saudi Arabia because the reason why I said at first, any plan, any affirmative plan is going to have to deal with arms sales is because we don't really give any aid to Saudi Arabia unless they want to go after um, things which are basically classified, and so the actual numbers we don't know about, such as intelligence sharing or mid-air refueling for bombers or fighter planes carrying out airstrikes over Yemen. Unless they want to talk about those things, which probably have been cut off significantly after the Senate did that vote. Unless they want to go after those things, then the aid that we do give them on the books amounts, I believe it was a year ago, to $732,000. Out of the foreign aid budget, that's nothing. And the reason why this is nothing is the reason why they get nothing is really because Saudi Arabia is not a poor country. Despite a lot of beliefs about countries in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia is an oil-rich country. They are very wealthy. They are literally just pumping out billions and billions of gallons. Maybe that's not the right number, but lots of oil. every year. So they're not really in need of aid, but rather they're in need of weapons. And so we don't actually send them weapons or send them foreign military financing where they can buy weapons from us using the money we give them. They just say, hey, what weapons will you let us have? We want to buy them. Again, obviously an oversimplification, but the gist is they don't want handouts, they want weapons. And they're willing to pay for them on their own.
Hmm.
So that's why they don't really get that much aid. Instead, they buy things. And so that's where topicality is going to get a little bit dicey, because an affirmative is going to try to justify how an arms sale, not an exchange or just giving them, well, it is an exchange, but not how we don't just give them weapons, but rather they buy them from us. They're going to have to justify how that counts as aid. And personally, I do not buy that argument that it counts as aid. I do think there are going to be people that disagree with me on that say arms sales do count as aid. So that's something that negatives have to be very careful and prepare against, and prepare with definitions on what constitutes aid, and does something that involves getting something in return for that exchange, does that count as aid or trade? I say trade. Some people will disagree with me. What are your thoughts,
Is it
Elijah?
uh okay, two things. One, is this the government selling like our top-notch weapons to the Saudi government, or is it like American governments being allowed to sell like Smith and Wesson guns to them,
Right. So this would be military weapons, just like, um,
like bombers
let's see.
and like
Yeah.
high-level stuff?
Well, an interesting thing. I don't think the United States government usually sells like our latest fighter jets or latest weapons.
No, we don't.
Uh, Typically, like you don't see a lot of countries lining up to buy F-22s because we don't sell them. Those are the latest gen, most superior fighters that we have in the United States that we know of. So you see countries usually buying things more like F-15s, F-16s, upgrading their fleets. I think Saudi Arabia right now has a bunch of F-5 and Tornado fighter jets, which are old and outdated, and so they're lining up. I believe, I'm sure President Trump has worked some on the $350 billion in long-term military purchase agreements that he's tried to work on with Saudi Arabia. I think that's something that they want to work on, upgrading that air force. But that's the kind of thing you see them buying.
Okay,
And
just updating,
that
but
question
not
actually leads me.
as updated
Mhm.
to we as we are. My second thing was, do you know if this is a recycled case from a previous year's resolution? It sounds a little bit like that, like came from a different resolution and they're tweaking it sort of so it can fit under aid.
Maybe, I'm not sure. I think it's depending on how people run it. If they run it from a human rights perspective, it could be a recycled thing theoretically. I don't. I've been in uh, I've been in team policy for a couple years in STOA, which is what we focus on here. Um, we haven't had a military aid resolution in several years. So I have not debated something military aid. So I don't think you're going to see high schoolers really recycling it from that, unless it was maybe from something NCFCA or something military
Okay.
related that they can use. But definitely, the Yemen focused cases are going to be more recent, since that's a more recent event that's taking place.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
and yeah, so I know I'm a little all over the place. I'm a little scatterbrained today, but some things that people running this case will need to justify or prove in order to win this case is they're going to have to show, if they run it as a human rights case, they're going to have to show that Saudi Arabia has horrible human rights and we shouldn't give them whatever it is, aid, arms sales, whatever. As a result, they could say because of Leahy laws, it's illegal for us to sponsor or aid countries that have gross violations of human rights. Um, they they could argue it along that line, or they could argue it just along a moral line, saying we shouldn't support this regime. If they're going to run it with Yemen, they need to show that Saudi Arabia is basically a major cause of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. I believe right now there's something like um, a very large number of people. I don't want to incorrectly quote numbers, but there's a large number of people within Yemen on the brink of starvation right now because of this crisis. There's blockades. Um, there's sieges going on over certain cities. So there's a lot of people who are getting just caught in the crosshairs that children are literally starving as a result. So they need to show that Saudi Arabia is a major cause of that, and
Uh,
that we
I have
need to use our.
I have
Yep,
data
go
here. It
ahead.
says you didn't know what exactly what it was. It was from the UNRefugees.org. It's 15 more than 15 million people, or about 53% of the Yemenis population, are on the brink of starvation.
Wow.
That's a lot of
Yeah.
people.
So definitely, it's a big issue. But not only do they have to prove that's a big issue and that Saudi Arabia is a big cause of it, they also have to show that we need to use our influence to somehow thwart this or something. Because at the end of the day, it, while morally there's a legitimate case to say we shouldn't support that,
It's not
it
going to
is much
change.
harder to say that right that we can't that we can change that. Because if we pull out, here's one of the arguments that you're going to see against this case. If we pull out and stop selling them weapons, we don't really give them that much aid. We sell them weapons, so that's what any affirmative team has to focus on. If we stop selling them weapons, what's going to happen? They're just going to go buy them from somebody else. They could buy them from Russia. They could buy them from China. They could probably buy some of the weapons from um, Britain or from Canada or from Germany or from France. They actually currently are underway with like a $15 billion military arms order from Canada of all places. And so I believe one of the cases, I don't know the details for every case. I know there are different versions out there. Um, and this is a case people are running, but I know one of the cases dealt with something like a $1.4 billion arms sale and cutting off that agreement, saying we won't give them these arms. Okay, well that's nice. You can say we're going to do that, and that's fine and dandy. But what about the $15 billion that they're getting just from Canada, not from a major arms selling country, but just from a country like Canada? What is our $1.4 billion arms agreement? What is cutting that off going to do to actually thwart anything in Yemen?
So the affirmative
Um,
has a big solvency problem that they need to prove that this will actually do something better.
Right. And then going into just furthermore, since we talked a lot about, what is this case? What are they going to be doing with it? Um, there's a lot of other issues with this case. So, like I said, with inherency, the Senate actually just voted to withdraw support for the Saudis' war in Yemen. So, what that means effectively is that you're going to see any American forces that are backing Saudi forces, whether that's mid-air refueling or whatever, in supporting this air campaign in Yemen, we're bugging out. We're not supporting them anymore. So our part in that is basically over. Um, Talking about topicality, there's definitely the argument that this is not foreign aid, but I've already covered that, so I won't spend too much time on it. But uh, furthermore, there's actually as of let's see, this is December 13th, 2018, so about a week or two ago, there was actually a peace agreement that was, I believe, made established. I believe. Let me see. This is from Julie Hirschfield Davis and Eric Schmidt, writing for the New York Times in December 13th. Quote: In late October, Mr. Mattis and Mr. Pompeo had called for a ceasefire in Yemen, and on Thursday, talks that were brokered by the United Nations and Sweden appeared to reach an agreement to ease the hostilities. The agreement calls for an exchange of up to 15,000 prisoners, the creation of a humanitarian corridor into the city of Taiz, and importantly, the withdrawal of troops from Hudaydah. That city, on the Red Sea, is a key entry point to Yemen for essential products like food and medicine. Uh, so there you have it right there. There's a peace agreement underway in Yemen. That's a big inherency issue for the affirmative, because if things are working out now and something good is coming out of this, then trying to stir up relations with Saudi Arabia or trying to cut off arms sales to them, which won't take place really for years because arms sales are not quickly moving things. Um, that's not necessarily going to actually do anything about this. It may already be over. Um, Other issues. So the $1.4 billion arms sale that I know one case focused on, I looked into that arms sale, and that's actually an arms sale of defensive systems and systems that would actually are training agreements between the United States and U.S. contractors and the Saudi Arabian military that would actually reduce civilian casualties. So it would be training on how to be more precise with military strikes so that we can avoid this big humanitarian problem of people getting caught in the crosshairs.
Hmm.
So, cutting off things like that, if you're saying we need to stop hurting civilians, you're going to be counterproductive if you pass this plan. A few other things. I won't go into too much detail. We'll move on to the next topic in just a second, but a few other things about this case. So, some of the other things that I have read about cases running this is that they're going to say, well, Saudi Arabia's been bad on terrorism. They haven't helped us fight terrorism the way they were supposed to, or they've actually helped terrorists. There's the argument that all the 9/11 hijackers were Saudi Arabian, and maybe they had state support, things like that. And there's actually a lot of evidence out there, if you look into it, about how Saudi Arabia is a big victim and target for terrorists, being the center of Islam religiously for having holy sites like Mecca and Medina. Saudi Arabia naturally gets targeted for a lot of terrorism, and so really it is in their best interest. Saudi Arabia, they will act in their best interest. You have to give them that as a country. If terrorism is against an enemy, chances are they might support that. If terrorism is against them, they're going to definitely fight it. And this is from Ali Shihabi, writing an editorial for Fox News. Quote, as custodian of Islam's holiest sites, Mecca and Medina, and as leader of the 41-nation Islamic coalition established to combat terror, Saudi Arabia is on the front line of the global fight against radical jihadi terrorism. He goes on talking about how a lot of the things with 9/11 hijackers and Al-Qaeda using Saudi Arabian citizens to carry out terrorist attacks, a lot of that's very intentional by terrorist groups, because the ultimate drive of terrorists is actually to do what the affirmative plan would intend upon of splitting up United States and Saudi Arabian sort of ties to create more division and make it easier to take down the regime. So it's a very complicated geopolitical situation, but when you get down to it, the issue of terrorism, which is one of the issues that I've heard teams are making on this case, a lot of the evidence really doesn't support moving in that direction, and that plays into what a lot of terrorists would love. Elijah, I'm really curious. What are your thoughts on some of that?
Oh, sorry, I phased out a little bit there. What was that? Did you just go against the disadvantage?
No,
What?
I was talking about. Sorry if I'm rambling. It's been a very long day. But the issues with some affirmative teams will say Saudi Arabia is not doing their part to fight terrorism, and so we should no longer support them for that reason. I'm not sure exactly of how teams are arguing
Oh,
that,
yeah. Okay. Um,
but
yeah,
but
I agree with what you
yeah.
said. When you said that they'll do whatever's best for them. I mean,
Hmm.
they don't really, unless they have an incentive to fight terrorism, they're gonna be like, hey, what if? We're just chilling here
Right.
with all
And
our oil.
since they're a target of a lot of it nowadays, since 2003, after 9/11, Saudi Arabia has been a big target of it. So as a result, they're incentivized to fight it, and they'll work with us, it seems, whenever it's in their best interest to fight it. Um, so there's some stuff out there for
So,
that.
so maybe if it could be an incentive, like if we could incentivize them with our arms, that for them to help fight better, that could be something. But that could be, let me think, that could be a good counter plan. Just incentivize them with the arms instead of cutting the arms. Or
Potentially.
would that be a minor repair or a counter plan?
That would really be um, probably a counter plan.
Okay.
Um, just depending, yeah, that would be a counter plan depending on how you word it. But
Okay.
okay, so that's sort of a side issue. I'm not sure how many teams will run that or how they'll run it, but let's get on to the really big issue here. Last but not least, with Yemen. Let's say best case scenario takes effect with any affirmative case, and if the affirmative plan passes, let's assume they're totally justified, they're right on everything. And in fact, they're even so right that by cutting off support for Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia completely pulls out of Yemen. All right, best case scenario. Then what happens? And here's where the affirmative team cannot win. Because if they claim to solve anything for Yemen, they can't solve it. One of the big issues here that a lot of people, we see this in the media, we see this in a lot of just cultural public opinion towards the situation. We see a lot of blame towards Saudi Arabia for this proxy war taking place in Yemen. And some of that is justifiable. But what we don't see is a lot of accountability or blame for other actors in this war. And the thing is, Saudi Arabia is not necessarily, depending on who you ask, is not necessarily the biggest player in Yemen. Arguably, the United Arab Emirates or even Iran are the biggest actors in there. Saudi Arabia is only one of them. And in fact, the US, the UK, and France have all been involved in supporting the Saudi position of fighting the Iranian backed forces in Yemen. So when you get down to it, there's a lot of countries involved here, and Saudi Arabia is just one of them. So, best case scenario, if the affirmative gets Saudi Arabia to pull out of Yemen, it's not going to fix the problem. In fact, it may just make it worse because it messes up the status quo, and we have no clue what's going to happen then. So, for any affirmative case to work, they need to show that there's going to be an improvement that's going to take place in Yemen, not just saying we don't back it anymore, but what do you do about it? How's it going to get better? And they have to show that other countries like Iran and the United Arab Emirates and well, a lot of Western countries are cutting off their support for this. We just did, but other countries like Iran and the United Arab Emirates are going to change their involvement in it or change how aggressive they are in it. Because if they don't change, nothing will change. And if the plan does nothing, even if it works and it gets Saudi Arabia, I know I'm rambling, so this will be my last point. But even if Saudi Arabia pulls out of the country, if that's all they do, so what? Why does that help us? Why does that make the status quo any better? Why should we pass the affirmative plan? The affirmative has to answer that. There's a lot of other issues I could go on with about this case. It's very, very complex. Some of the intertwined religious and ethnic groups in the region, and some of the probably factors behind the war. So I don't want to seem overly simplistic here. But there's a lot of ways you can approach this plan from an affirmative position. You can look at human rights. You can look at Yemen. You can look at Jamal Khashoggi. From a negative position, you can look at is this actually aid or is this an arms sale? You can look at if this works, will it do anything? You can look at will it work? Will they just buy arms from somebody else? You can look at are these offensive weapons that they're buying that will actually contribute to this war, or are they defensive weapons which are intended to prevent civilian casualties or save lives and just protect people within Saudi Arabia? That doesn't seem like the kind of thing we should really try to punish. There's a lot of other ways you could look at it as well, but I will leave it there. I think that's a pretty thorough thing. Before we close on that, do you have any closing thoughts on this case or some of the arguments for or against it, Elijah?
Not much. I'm just gonna say that as negative, I'd probably be hitting them really hard on solvency. That's where I see most of the problems. That's what I would do personally.
Awesome. I 100% agree. Okay, so moving down, guys, talking about local regional procurement, one of the cases this year that seems to be at least a little bit popular, dealing with how we deliver food aid and how that affects starving people around the world. Elijah, what are your thoughts on this?
Um, so I ran this several times. It's what I used at my last debate. I'll just say it's a really good case. I like it a lot. Basically, this case seeks to change the physical shipments of food that we send and take that money and buy the food in their own local and regional markets. The advantages would be that they get there faster and it's cheaper, and therefore we can buy more. Overall, the case is pretty sound. I'm just gonna go over a few points I have on it. There's a really killer piece of evidence I'm just gonna say, and this one was really a knockout. I would use every time, and it's really hard to argue against. I'm just gonna say it's that there's a specific change. These researchers say that in their computer models, if we change from now and change it directly to LRP, there will be a 16% reduction in child mortality. Which, I mean,
Wow.
who doesn't want a 16% reduction in child mortality?
So using same budgets, using
Just switching
same
it to LRP.
thing, just by buying the food there. And why is that? For those of whom are listening to this who maybe haven't looked into that case too much, why is it that just switching where we buy food, whether for a little bit of background, LRP, if I'm correct, would switch us from buying food here in the United States and then shipping it overseas to other countries to buying it in that town or in that country or in that region of the world
Yeah.
that's much closer and can deliver the food faster. Why would that influence things?
Well, if there was an emergency, it'd be much easier to get a truck from 50 miles away full of food than it would be to get it from across the ocean, a ship from across the ocean that would take like 3 months. And I think there was some evidence on that. It was like 2 to 4 months faster. Let me see. Yeah, it's like 2 to 4 months faster than shipping on average.
Right.
So it's faster, and then you can buy more food. Let me see, where did I write this? Okay, yeah. There's more because it's less costly. Like US, we use a lot of capital, so it costs more to make stuff a lot here. Same like China uses less capital and it costs less. So it costs less to buy from the farmers in Africa. So we could buy more with the cash. And there's a piece of evidence that said we can get at least 4 to around 10 million more people food if we switch to LRP, which is another pretty good piece of evidence. And then this is a third one. I really like it because it's like economic forces, which I did a class in and it was kind of fun. Just looking at how these things, like
It makes sense,
everything just, it's like a big old puzzle and you have to figure out how it does. It helps local markets. Well, that was something that we had to argue against. It doesn't really help local markets. It just doesn't damage them. Because when we send them
Mhm.
a shipment full of grain or cucumbers, then all the farmers there who make cucumbers, they can't compete with the really cheap price or the free cucumbers because they can't sell their cucumbers for free. They need to eat too,
Right.
and they
And,
can't.
and that raises a question which I'm actually curious. Uh, Maybe you could explain a little bit about the case or if this is an issue for it. Um, Take, for example, instances in Haiti. I'm not sure if you're aware or not, but there was environmental disaster there a few years ago. And what happened was the agriculture, everything in the country was destroyed. The market got flooded with foreign aid. And at first, that was great because no one could grow anything, so people didn't starve. That was nice. And then what happened afterwards was even after things were rebuilt, there was no reason to rebuild the agriculture industry because there was so much free food coming in from other countries, and countries even to this day have still been giving a lot of aid to Haiti. I think it's gone down, so I'm not sure how significant that would be for a case, but that's been a big issue in Haiti is because since the market has been really skewed by all of this free food getting flooded into it, no one's growing anything. And so you can't come back from that and recover and produce an agriculture industry and ever become self-sufficient if that's taking place, which leads me to my question. Um, in the first instance of that, when the agriculture market, when everything was destroyed
Hmm.
and they couldn't grow food locally, so they had to send food in,
Hmm.
how would the LRP case affect that? Would they just revert back to sending food in, or would there be sort of no plan for that?
That was actually a big point of contention when the negative argued against me, my partner. Um, there was it's local and regional. So basically I said, okay, if locally it's all messed up, we'll get it from the nearest source. And 99 times out of 100, it's gonna be way cheaper than shipping it from the US because the US, just about everything here costs more than like other countries. So
Right, because we have such high standards for
yeah.
production and stuff.
So Haiti, I don't know about that specifically, but other countries, maybe a bit farther away, we'd probably just go to the next country over. Uh,
Right.
even the
Is
next
it still
country after that.
possible under this case that food
Yeah.
would be bought from the U.S.?
Uh, let me see.
If, say,
The
for example, there
definition
was a
is it's a purchase of commodities for emergency food aid by donors in countries with food needs or in another country within the region. So, I mean, Cuba, if we're sending it to Cuba, I mean, that's close enough that we could probably do it with, we could probably send it from the US. So, yes, we could do it from US. We could still keep it from US, but most likely it's going to be way cheaper to just get it from the next country over.
interesting. And out of curiosity, on this case, you're much more familiar about it than I
Yeah.
am. Are there countries or um, instances where the United States or another country has tried out this local or regional procurement process before? So going to the neighboring country or town and acquiring a bulk amount of food to basically feed an entire city or village. Um, have there been instances of where that happens? And the reason why I ask that is because my mind goes to the industrialized versus non-industrialized aspects of this. So, for example, if you're going to Mexico, if you're in Mexico buying food to go to Colombia or something, I don't know, some country in that region, um, I see the issue of would there be enough food that is readily available within a market or that is ready to go, really, that's quick enough, that is industrialized, like in the United States we have, where you can just on the fly order this bulk amount of food. Is that available, and has that worked in other countries? Because that seems like a sort of solvency issue that could be presented in these regions.
It sounded like two questions, sort of. Here, let me just process that for a second.
Go
Okay.
for it, my bad.
It sounded a little bit like why. Oh, yes. So how we had like pilot programs with LRP. Not really.
Yeah.
I didn't. There isn't any in the evidence that I've used. I haven't found a need for it so far. Which that would be cool though. I will check. That's a good point to put in. But in the inherency, it says that we have a fact that says over 90% of all U.S. food aid is required by law to be transoceanic shipments of physical commodities. So, I mean, there isn't really too much room to try this out, like, because 90% is already in physical commodity. I forgot the second part. Could you repeat that again?
Right.
Like, really quick.
So the first part was dealing with have we ever done it before, and the second part was um, how do we know that food will be available in other countries? So, like in the United States, if I want to buy some bulk amount of food, assuming I have the money and the contracting abilities, whatever, the connections,
Oh,
I can do that
okay.
because
I see
there's
what you mean.
big farms, all that. Do we have that in other countries? Is that available in a lot of these very poverty stricken places? How we do that there?
That's actually one of the points that the negative did use, and it's a good point to go. It's if the localities and regions are ready to supply that. Maybe not even just the food, but like you said, transportation and quickly enough. And well, that was something. It's like they'd bring up the negative would bring up these fringe cases where it was like in this here it wasn't fast as you say, or here it wasn't it was actually cost more than shipping from the US. The
Hmm.
basically I argued that on a whole, we have all this evidence on average, like we'll get 16% less, and on average we'll get 4 to 10 million more people fed. That's better than right now. That's still better, even though it's not perfect. The negative would argue that it's not a silver bullet, and I agreed that. I agreed with them. It is not a silver bullet. No policy ever is, but it's way better than what we have right now, and my
Right.
evidence proves that. So
Does this
maybe it
plan?
wouldn't be able to supply them, and we'd have to go out of our way to go find contacts or things like that. But on the whole, it's still better.
Okay. I might have already asked this a little bit, but um, I'll put it a little bit clearer this time. Um, so with this case, does this leave the room for flexibility for if it is cheaper, if it is easier, if it is better for whatever reason to buy food from the United States and ship it rather than buying it locally or regionally? Is
Yeah,
that allowed under this
it
case?
does leave that leeway, I believe. I read it out loud a second ago, the definition for LRP. Refers to the purchase of commodities for emergency food aid by donors in countries with food needs or in another country within the region. So, I mean, I guess that is kind of restricted to regional.
Right,
Maybe
right.
maybe it needs a better definition, but this thing allows
Could
for if it's closer, but I don't know if it would be better for like I don't for some reason I
do
can't think of a reason why it would
right.
be better. Like maybe if there was Ebola outbreak in all the countries surrounding one country, we couldn't go get the food there because we'd spread it or something. And then
Does the mandate of this case specifically say that we have to use LRP or that we remove the requirement for using domestically produced and physically shipped items from the United States
it's
to these countries?
the plan is to
How does that play out?
this plan is to switch U.S. food aid from transoceanic shipments to cash-based assistance. So we just switch it over. We don't. Yeah, we're just switching it over. Um,
Okay, so sorry, this will be the last question from me on this. When you say cash-based assistance, for everyone listening, does that mean we give the people cash or we give cash to our aid workers there who can buy food locally?
that's a bit of each. It depends. So sometimes we can give vouchers, sometimes we can give cash to the people, sometimes we can give it to the workers. Uh, it'd probably depend on the case, whichever is best, and that'd be up to the aid
And
workers.
that would go through our channels, but not the channels necessarily of the host government. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely not. We are not giving free money to governments. That is a
Okay,
terrible idea.
awesome. Just checking.
Yeah.
I could definitely see a lot of arguments coming up about that. So fantastic.
Okay.
What are some?
I
Go
have a
ahead.
few things. For the affirmative, there's 2 points I want to go over to watch out for. This came up. It was CPFA, the CPAFA cargo shipment rules that I can't remember it really well, but do you remember? It was like we have to keep it on flagships, and we're not gonna on U.S. flagships right now. And it was used in another case, but we have to keep
Right.
a lot of our food aid shipments on CPF on cargo preference for food aid. We have
Right, so they have to
to.
be shipped on U.S. flagged vessels, which are much more expensive to use for transportation. And the argument is similar to with the LRP that we could ship it faster and cheaper if we switched the requirements for what vessels we ship it over.
Uh,
Um,
yeah,
and
the
right,
negative said that we have this problem because of the CPFA is in the way. We can't, even if you voted, we can't move this forward. And I just brought up the fiat power thing. I think that's right, but the fiat power is basically if the affirmative gets the ballot, then it's going to happen. It doesn't need to depend on anything else. If I'm saying that right, so that point was kind of
right.
redundant.
You can fiat your mandate. I'm not sure. It sounds like you're saying the other team was arguing that because of the issue with the CPFA regulations in place, that's what's driving up the cost. So going after something else will not necessarily fix the cost, is what it sounds like they were saying.
They were
Um,
saying that because of the CPFA, it's not gonna be very possible because we don't have like if we're in one country in Africa and we can ship it over from from a different country in Africa that's closer, we may not have any flag vessels there at the time. Uh,
right.
so
Okay. Right.
that's in the
So
way.
right. Okay. So
And then
right.
there
You
were
can.
a handful of cases, which is in the negative brief. For if you write this, you'll want to find them, um, in which LRP was more expensive. Like examples of this are like corn and soy flour, I think, and vegetable oil in Argentina, in just Argentina. And then they had some for Brazil and things like that, where it would have been better to ship from US, which is allowed under the definition. But yeah, I basically just argue it's still better overall, even though it's a
Right.
little bit, you have these fringe cases. And then real quick, I have the negative, negative points to go over if you're running against this case. Some points to go over: corruption, for one. Although I didn't really see this, I don't see this come against me very much, which I don't see why not. It's like if it's cash, it's more likely to get laundered or stolen than just like 3 tons of grain, which and then you already went
Right.
over if the localities and regions are ready to supply them, like if they've been heavily dependent on food aid and things like that. It's a good point to make. Another one was inflation of food prices could happen. Like if we have a bunch of cash influxed into a small economy and they're all paying for their cucumbers, then all the cucumber farmers are going to be like, hey, wait, there's more people have more money. Why don't we raise our prices for
Right.
cucumbers because they can afford it? And then over the long run, they, everybody doesn't have as much money, or some people don't have as much money at the same time, and it affects them badly. That's kind of like market
Right.
forces. The market forces will even that out based on the cash influx. So
Is there a way that they could just get around this theoretically with uh, using, I don't know, some sort of digital bank transfer as opposed to using them physical cash? I'm assuming there's a little bit of room for flexibility in that mandate.
I don't think there's a definition for cash, but that's a good point.
But there is a
I would,
possibility from the
if I was
negative view.
arguing against that, I'd say yes, there is flexibility. There's no definition for cash, so the cash quotation marks, could
It could
be
mean any form of
Bitcoin
monetary
or
assistance. It could be a
Zimbabwean
wire
dollars
transfer.
or wire transfer. Yeah,
Right, right, which would really make more sense than sending just a pallet of cash to some third world country. That just sounds like asking for trouble.
yeah.
Okay. Um, and then as we just kind of wrap this up, what are some of the other issues? Um, Closing thoughts on this case.
Yeah, minor point, which I really, I looked really hard for a piece of evidence saying that this is a good advantage. Uh, Basically, if it's locally or regionally procured, then the food that they get will be better suited for local tastes. Although I couldn't find any evidence of this being an important advantage, it's kind of just a good bonus. I mean, who wants to eat
Right.
some
Like
weird thing from us when they could just
if we
eat
send
their
sliced
kebab?
cheese to Indians, they're probably not going to want to eat that.
They could be like,
Um,
"Oh, what?
and
What
so
is
that probably
that?
won't.
Gross."
Right, right. So sending food that is essentially foreign to people of a very particular culture probably will not help as many people as it could because they don't know what to do with it. That could be a valid point. I don't know, but that's definitely an interesting point, and I'm sure there's some literature out there on that. Okay. Next, I believe we have our phrase of the week. Do you want to take it away, Elijah?
Yeah. Okay. So, phrase of the week. We do this every week. Speed and spread delivery. Basically, this is a style of speaking that seeks to spit out as many arguments as possible in a short amount of time. It's the 300 word per minute debates you'll see at universities and such. Personally, I don't really like them. The only people who can hear them are are debaters and the judges, and so an audience can't really understand what's going on, and it's only limited to those ears. Um, James Talley, a debater who wrote a piece on this, explained it saying that, quote, for the most part, the rapid delivery strategy is simple. Lodge enough arguments of varying degrees of quality that the opposition will be unable to address them all. Then focus on the unaddressed arguments and use these in combination with the no new issues and rebuttals rule to claim victory. This tactic is especially useful for the negative team. If you can spit out so many arguments that the affirmative can't answer them, then you've technically won because the affirmative dropped their arguments. So if you can speak fast enough, you might just win. Tally wrote some interesting stuff on this. I recommend this piece, and I will put it in the description. The CC of SC rules, which is the league that I've been competing in, state that this form is considered antithetical to purpose and intent of this event and is not allowed, which I agree with them because, I mean, what's the point of debating if you can't change minds besides your own and your opponent? I don't
So
know about Stoa though, because for some reason when I searched what for Stoa rules, it was like locked and you had to have a login password. Do you know what this is? What
um,
it is regarding
okay,
Stoa?
so let me ask you really quickly. I actually was not aware that there was any rule against this. I don't think there's any rule necessarily on it in Stoa. When you
Okay.
say this tactic, which totally makes sense, do you mean is there a specific standard for what constitutes this within the rules? Is it just speaking really fast in general that they say they don't want, or
Well, I mean,
um,
that's a good point. What defines speed and spread delivery? I mean, that might be up to the judge.
right?
But it'd be like so fat. It'd be the point is to lodge as many arguments so that the opponent can't answer them all.
Right.
So that might be 200 words per minute or it might be 150. We have to see like real intent there, and then we gotta see um, people people going to whatever it is needed to try to win by technicality. Uh,
Interesting. Uh,
Christian, you've told me that you've done some pretty fast debate talking. I'm
right.
guessing at
Right.
Nighthawk. What was the fastest you've debated?
Right. So interesting thing that I've noticed on that. I have a few notes on or comments on this.
Okay, yeah.
Um, First of all, with regard to Stoa, I don't believe this is banned.
Okay.
It could be. I've never even heard of this rule in CCFSE, and I've definitely seen people abuse this tactic in CCFSE. So that's
Whoa.
a new one
Okay.
to me.
Yeah, because
Um,
it's in the rules and regulations for team policy.
right. I wonder when that was added. I remember about 2 years ago there was some major abuse by one or two teams of that tactic, running, for example, 15 disadvantages in a period of like 2 minutes. So I've definitely
Ooh.
seen that before, um, and I have lost to that before. So that's interesting. The fastest I've heard people speak, I'm not sure if I could label a word per minute count, but to give you an idea, I listen to things in my spare time. I listen to podcasts a lot. I listen to podcasts usually at about 1.5 to 2 times speed, somewhere in that range. If
So you
I'm
can
listening
do it
to a
faster?
lecture for school. What's that?
So you can get it done faster?
Right, right.
Okay.
I listen to things at high speed. In fact, if I listen to things at normal speed, oftentimes they sound slow to me and they bore me. Even if other people would say that what podcast or whatever is, oh, that person's talking so fast. I would listen to that and say that sounds really slow. It's kind of boring. So I listen to things at high speed all the time.
Okay.
Usually the slowest for me is 1.5 times speed, so 150% speed is what I listen to stuff at, and that's totally normal for me. It makes sense. I can comprehend it 99% of the time.
Okay.
I have heard people speak so fast in rounds. I've done this before where I generally talk very fast, and I've listened to things where I've talked afterwards and not been able to understand myself. I was talking so fast. I have heard rounds like that where I literally cannot make out the words they're saying because they are talking so fast. And an interesting thing that I've observed with better debaters and with debaters at Night Talk, things like that, nationals, uh, is that debaters learn. First of all, they learn how to gauge how they're speaking. So if it's a newer judge, and if they can perceive that, if they learn about that, they will slow down their pace to match that audience and match the situation. Meanwhile, if it is a more experienced judge that's been judging for a while that they know can pick up all those arguments and run with them on the flow, on the ballot, then they will speed up and they will talk faster and they will still have total control over what they're saying and over their pace, but they will speak at a faster pace and they will make sure that people can keep up with that. Um, the other thing is that yes, they do sometimes speak faster. They're not slow in the sense that they are pausing. More experienced debaters, maybe sometimes they will pause for some sort of emphasis, but generally they speak at a rate that is uh, fast but not too fast. Sometimes slower but not. And by that I mean basically they will always speak at a comfortable pace, and their pace will make sure that they're not rambling and that they are not um, they're capable of fitting everything in to the time they need to. That's a hard thing to do. I know for me, I tend to ramble a little bit sometimes. I've been doing it today, but in speeches, more experienced speakers will speed up enough where they're engaging, but not too fast. That's the best way I think I could summarize it.
Okay.
That was a long answer, but there's a lot of different ways people do it. So
Okay.
awesome,
That's good. Okay.
awesome. So
Should
last thing. Oh, go ahead.
Are we going to mention again our awesome sponsors?
I think I should. Speaking of our awesome sponsors, Impact Debate Coaching. Again, guys, I have personally experienced this and benefited from it. I personally plan on acquiring this membership to Impact Debate Coaching, so I recommend it wholeheartedly. But guys, seriously, 3 affirmative cases, well-written affirmative cases, at least 10 top-notch negative briefs, access to coaches, special discounts, so much more. Guys, what are you thinking? Guys, if you plan on going to Night Talk, if you plan on going to Nationals, if you're listening to this regardless of what end of the country you're on, what are you thinking if you're limiting yourself specifically to what everyone has, and that is typically Monument Publishing? The briefs, they cost a lot more for Monument Publishing. They're oftentimes good, but lacking in certain areas, just depending on what you're doing. Guys, Impact Debate speech and debate coaching, they're run by debaters, former debaters, and they get information from current debaters at tournaments, just like Monument does, but they're very local based. I know the people behind it. I endorse it wholeheartedly. I encourage you to check it out. And guys, it's only $45. What are you missing out on? Guys, check it out. It's pretty good. It's worth it.
You can check
Okay,
it out at impactdebatecoach.com. Again, that's impactdebatecoach.com.
absolutely. Okay, so enough of me rambling about the awesome debate services out there.
Yeah.
Our last topic of the day, military aid to Egypt. So we might have gotten a little out of order here. I think we did, talking about first Yemen, then the LRP case. But let's talk a little bit about Egypt, because this is a very popular case this year. People are running it out the wazoo. So what is this case? Well, for those of whom haven't really dealt with it much, which is probably no one, but if you're that person, forgive me. The case is basically to cut military aid to Egypt or cut all aid to Egypt, depending on the case and the team running it. So I've seen it either way. I've seen a team that wrote their own version of the case before Monument Publishing came out with something on it, and their case was to specifically, not specifically, to just entirely cut aid to Egypt. Now, if you go with a source book case, it might be a little bit more specific. But the issue is really, it comes down to human rights in Egypt and other factors like the legitimacy of the government of Egypt. Are they run by the military or are they run by the people? If it's democratic, they're run by the people. If it's run by the military, then, well, it's not democratic, and it's not what the United States typically likes to endorse. That being said, basically, what it boils down to is the government is run by the military, and by pumping billions of dollars into it every year or so, we preserve the status quo in Egypt, or we preserve some sense of stability by supporting the military, which is really that stability in the region. By being oppressive and being strong, you might say, the military is essentially an awful force in the country, but at the same time, from a geopolitical perspective, they keep Egypt from going to war just on a whim with other countries, which some people will probably say would happen if they were a totally democratically run country, because there's a lot of anti-Israel sentiment, a lot of anti-American sentiment within the country. So if they were to elect democratic leaders and have really legitimate elections, I think there's some good arguments out there that they would essentially go to war with Israel. Probably not the United States. That wouldn't work very well. But they would not be definitely not as strong of an ally, and they probably would not support our interests in the Middle East as much. So that's sort of a breakdown of the issue in Egypt right now. Going off the human rights a little bit, so what teams are going to say is that they historically have been oppressive, and that it's getting worse really within Egypt. So the Egyptian government banned non-governmental organizations, and recently limited that ban just to basically any NGO dedicated to human rights. So human rights are really getting oppressed within Egypt. They've incarcerated and killed thousands of people, I believe. I think it was in 2016. There was in Tahrir Square something like 1,000 or so people that were just slaughtered by the military in a mass protest.
What?
There's a lot of awful stuff going on there. That's the gist of it. And since there are laws in the books which ban the United States government from giving aid, military aid, to militaries which practice things that lead to human rights abuses, gross violations of human rights, killing people recklessly, things like that would constitute that. It carries a legal question of, is it legal for us to give aid to this country? And a lot of people will say no. There's the moral issue. Should we support this regime? A lot of people say no. But then there's the other issue of, does the end justify the means, in terms of, well, by supporting this regime and supporting the awful regime as it is right now, we can prevent a greater evil from occurring, of some change happening. Change is always, when you're dealing with geopolitics, you want stability. And by having some radical change potentially coming through, if the regime changes, You could experience a war. You could experience a civil war, all of which would be much, much more bloody than what's currently happening in Egypt. So that's the general position I think you're going to see um, negative teams come from. Of, okay, this is bad, but we're only going to make it worse if we suddenly cut off this aid. Some affirmatives will be smart with this, and they will say, we're going to condition this. So we're going to offer to give it back if they change their ways. So if they stop killing people in the streets, if they get a little bit better for the cameras, if they stop slaughtering people, which sounds very cynical, but that's really what that's what happens in countries like this when you have militaries in power that have practically no accountability, and you have puppet governments that are run by the military. Awful things happen, and it's just a matter of fact in these countries. The details may differ depending on who you ask, but at the end of the day, it's not a good situation. And so the question is going to be, can we use this aid as leverage to convince them to change their ways?
Question real quick.
Absolutely.
Is there evidence that Egypt uses our aid enough for it to be like in comparison to their own budgets? Is it that big of a blow for us to condition it and take it off, or would it be better for them just to keep doing
20%
what they're
of their
doing?
military funding. 20% of their military funding comes from United States aid.
That is quite a sum.
Right. And since the military runs the government, that has an even more significant amount of leverage, you might say. Then
Okay.
here's another interesting argument, which this is something that I don't know how good of an argument it is, but it's something I hope that at the very least people listening to this will think about when going into rounds is, if these people, and this is sort of leaning towards the affirmative a little bit, if these people are so radical that within this country or within the government or within the military, that if we stop giving them $1 billion every year, if we stop playing nice with them and bribing them basically, and then they churn on us and become our enemy or lead to some massive war or something just because we cut off $1 billion, if they're willing to do that, are they really our friends or our allies or people we should be aligning ourselves closely with and strategically with in the Middle East in the first place? And I think the answer to that, just a common sense answer to that, would probably be no. When you look at the details, it gets a whole lot more complicated though, because by partnering with Egypt, by theoretically encouraging them, I'll say, to keep in place the Camp David Accords, which are a peace agreement with Israel and Egypt, so they don't go to war. They don't have another 1967 style conflict involving multiple countries all backed against Egypt. Arguably, it's a good thing what we're doing right now, but again, there's a lot of dynamics you have to look at, and you have to ask, do we want to go with the evil that we know, which is supporting human rights abusers in the Middle East, or do we want to go with the evil we don't know, which is, if we cut that off, how are they going to respond? Elijah, I'm curious, what are your thoughts as you look at this case and the arguments for or against it?
I think both the negative and the affirmative have really strong points, which you've gone on. This could really be a debate. This could come into how well the debaters carry themselves, because each has really good points, with the affirmative saying that there's all this evil and we shouldn't do it, and like running like a condition, as you said.
Right.
That would be probably the best way to move forward with this. Then the negative could very well argue that we don't know what this erratic and authoritarian government could do, let out of our hands.
Right. And then there's also other questions like, well, aside from the Camp David Accords, why do we partner with Egypt in the first place? I mean, the Camp David Accords were in the 1970s, 80s, 90s. I don't remember the exact year off the top of my head, but uh, nonetheless, they were years and years ago. So why are we still giving them $1 billion every year? And then you dive into the other issues of, well, there's terrorism in the region, and there's securing the Sinai Peninsula, or not the Sinai Peninsula, the Suez Canal. There's all these strategic things with Egypt. The Suez Canal really being a big one because it allows us to get our military troops and ships and supplies through the Middle East much more easily. And that's a big issue. That's one of the arguments, I think, from the negative, that if we cut off support for the Egyptians, then they will cut off our access to the Suez Canal. I don't think there's a lot of good evidence that they're willing to do that. And there's probably evidence out there that we could keep that from happening, but it would likely not be easy. That's really a whole another issue. But things like, why are we there in the first place? When you take away all those other issues, and there's things like fighting terrorism. So if we cut off the support for Egypt, will terrorism suddenly get the upper hand in Egypt, or will other groups which are mutual enemies of Egypt and the United States, will ISIS get stronger in the region? Will things like that occur? I don't think those arguments are necessarily the strongest, but they're definitely arguments that are out there. So again, with this case, I totally agree with you. A lot of it comes down to how well does the team know the case and the arguments for and against it, and how do they carry themselves? Because I could see this going either way. I haven't debated this a lot. I've debated this once. We won that round by running a minor repair that, by recognizing the gross violations of human rights by the Egyptian military, rather than doing a mandate to cut off the aid, we just do a minor repair of, or the State Department to investigate it. And if what the affirmative says is true, that there are these awful human rights abuses, enforce the Leahy law, laws which are on the books for the DoD and the Department of State, and just cut off military support in enforcement or in application of existing law, which bans supporting human rights abusing militaries. If you guys are interested, if you're listening to this and you've never heard of those laws, or you want us to talk a little bit more about that in a later podcast, please email us and let us know. But that's how we argued against it, and we won. I think it will get more complicated, though, whenever more teams run this and when more experienced teams run it. And I would be curious to see the arguments on both sides that will occur moving forward.
Credits to this video go to many people. Your hosts today were Elijah and Christian. Credits for the editing go to Elijah. Credits for the musical intro go to Bear Studios. This production was in part supported by Donuts, helping mankind since their inception, and Impact Debate Coaching, the impact of excellence. If you would like to send us a flow, brief, or case to look at, don't hesitate. Send it to us at teampolicypodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's teampolicypodcast@gmail.com. We hope to see you next time on the Team Policy Podcast broadcast. Thank you for listening.